Very warm welcome to today's event. It's a partnership between RUSI and the Icrc, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you. I'm Karen Von Hippel, the Director General at RUSI, and we are really pleased to be partnering with the Icrc on this project. It's a launch of their new guide called Allies, Partners, and Proxies, Managing Support Relationships in Armed Conflict to Reduce the Human Cost of War. The title says it all. It's quite lengthy, but it really does explain what we want to talk about today. This subject of support relationships is really core to RUSI's work, and that's why we were so delighted to partner with the Icrc on this event. We will be talking really today about the full range of support relationships, which include the more traditional support, such as US, UK, UN, NATO, peace support operations, including regular defense diplomacy, the type of advisory assistance work that militaries provide, through to other types of support relationships, and that often comes from neighboring countries getting involved in conflicts, including countries further afield, as we've seen in Syria with Russia getting involved, as well as non-state actors, including militias and mercenaries. And many of them are supported by a wide range of external partners, state and non-state. So it's an incredibly complicated subject. I'm still not entirely sure. I think the jury's still out on whether or not there's been an increase in partnered warfare in recent years, because I think we've always had partnered warfare, but maybe today it's more complex and greater lethality, more actors. So looking forward to discussing all of these issues. We do know that external actors can prolong an exacerbated conflict, as we've seen in Syria, or if the right type of pressure is applied in a concerted fashion, the external actors can help bring an end to a conflict. And today we want to consider a number of the more protracted as well as more recent conflicts that we're facing globally, whether that's Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, the counter-ISIL campaign, and even more recently, Mozambique has been facing a challenge. And these all have involved a number of external actors. Sometimes it's very difficult, even if you know a lot about a conflict, to try to distinguish and disentangle who is doing what and who is supporting which groups on the ground. So really looking forward to not only hearing Icrc's view on this from their neutral, impartial perspective, but also we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts who are going to help us talk through these issues in greater detail. What I'd like to do right now is briefly introduce 4 speakers and then explain a bit more about how we will proceed today. So first, we will hear from Thomas Haudier, who is the head of Icrc Support Relations and Armed Conflict Initiative. And they really work on how to manage these support relationships in order to protect civilians and others. And others, they mean wounded and detainees. The Icrc's goal in many of these, and they can speak on this better than I can, is to reduce the human costs of war. Thomas was previously in charge of Icrc's activities in 14 countries in Northern and Central Europe, as well as in Turkey. And he's also worked in the field. He's served in Central Asia and Afghanistan and the Caucasus. Prior to Icrc, he has worked for the UN, the European Commission, and a consultancy called Capgemini. So he will talk about the conclusions, the handbook, some of the findings, lessons learned, and then he will not be joining for the panel. The panel will consist of 3 speakers, and let me just introduce them alphabetically. First is Major General James Chiswell, who is retired. He is now an advisor to a number of organizations and companies, including Entrepreneur First, which is a pre-seed accelerator. See how many people know what that means, which helps technical entrepreneurs build startups from scratch through funding, mentoring, and support. Previously, James held a very distinguished career in the British Army. He was commissioned into the Parachute Regiment and has held a number of roles during his 36-year military career, serving in Northern Ireland, Cyprus, Bosnia, Washington, D.C., Kosovo, Sierra Leone, several parts of South America, Afghanistan, and Iraq, And his last position in the Army was Director of Special Forces. So he's really a career officer who has just so much experience working in conflicts and working often with local partners. So he'll bring us some grounded truth about this subject. Let me just also mention he was awarded the Military Cross for his actions in Sierra Leone, amongst many other honors. Then we will hear from Ms. Otilia Anna Manganese, who is head of special projects in the Office of the Executive Director and a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. She has been there since 2009, and her research expertise is in international criminal justice, international human rights, law, transnational threats, and human security and development. So she really also covers a range of areas relevant to our conversation today. Before joining ISS, she was a junior legal advisor for Rhodes University's Legal Aid Clinic and human rights education officer for Amnesty International. And then last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Peter Maurer, who is the president of the Icrc, and he has been in this role since 2012. As many of you know, Icrc works is a humanitarian organization working in over 80 countries. And under Dr. Maurer's leadership at Icrc, he's really been focusing on humanitarian diplomacy, respect for international humanitarian law, and improving humanitarian response through innovation and new partnerships. So also very relevant, of course, to today's discussion. Before he became the president of the Icrc, he was Switzerland's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and also ambassador and head of Switzerland's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York. He has served in Bern, Pretoria, and the Swiss mission to the UN. So we'll hear first from Thomas for about 10 minutes or so to talk about the handbook, and then I'll turn to the panel and I will ask a few questions, then I will open it up to your questions. So please start to type in your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. Just for everyone's awareness, this entire event is on the record, including the Q&A. So let me now turn to Thomas and tell us about the practical guide. Oops, you're on mute, Thomas. Thomas, you're on mute still. Yeah.
Right, 1, 2. Is this better? I believe so. My apologies. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. von Hippel, for the introduction. My name is indeed Thomas Allier, and I'm the head of the Icrc Support Relationships in Armed Conflict Initiative. Thank you for joining us, for everyone on this call today. We are very excited to be launching our first publication entitled Allies, Partners and Proxies, Managing Support Relationships in Armed Conflict to Reduce the Human Cost of War. Maybe I'll start with a couple of words about this initiative, what it aims for. Alliances, partnerships, the use of proxies, none of these are really new features of warfare. But in the Icrc's experience over the last couple of decades of humanitarian operations on the ground, they are an increasingly common feature of major conflicts and a feature that is here to last. As conflicts become increasingly complex, the cost of that complexity is overwhelmingly borne by civilians, by the wounded, by detainees, families of missing, and so on and so forth. And a lot of attention is usually paid to the last operators, to those pulling the triggers, to the detaining authorities, and rightly so. However, in these complex major conflicts, it's the Icrc's experience that actors on the ground are likely to seek, and actually to get, support from external actors for the pursuit of their military objectives. And it is this mutual influence, it is the mutual influence resulting from these special bonds that are created that the Icrc is interested to explore and to inject humanitarian considerations into. So whenever and wherever there is influence, we believe that there is an opportunity to make a humanitarian difference. Hence the launch in 2019 of this Support Relationships in Armed Conflict initiative. Now, the publication, and I'm copying in the chat a link for those interested in taking a closer look to it. It's the first publication of this initiative. It will be declined. This is the link to really the longer version. Over the coming weeks, you will find a shorter, more executive version. There will be a dedicated website to it as well. What it strives for, it aims to bring decision makers, their advisors, but really anyone involved in the design, in the implementation, eventually in the oversight of a support relationship, to answer 5 overarching questions that are essential to the proper framing of their support. Question number 1, what type of conflict, what type of actors, what type of support and activities are involved in the support relationship? The type of conflict, the lawyers on this call will know it better than I do. It can be an international armed conflict, it can be a non-international armed conflict, and this will have consequences on the legal framework applied. The type of actors, whether these special bonds, these support relationships involve states, non-state armed groups, international coalitions, maybe peacekeeping forces, private military security companies, all this as well will shape and frame the relationship in a way or another and have potential consequences for civilians. The type of support as well, we in the Icrc tend to take a rather wide approach to support beyond pure partnered military operations. It can be political support brought as a matter of foreign policy. It can be arms transfers. It can be financial support, institutional capacity building. All these create a room for influence. Question number 2. What are the gaps between the intent, the leadership, and the capacity of the prospective partners? These for us are really central tenets that need to be considered by any actor at any moment of the relationship, because they will define success or failure, possibly in the pursuit of the military objectives, but this is not really something of interest to the Icrc, but by all means in the ability to protect those not fighting, civilians, detainees, wounded, and so on and so forth. So a key assessment is really to be made in order to increase the likelihood that the partnership will remain within the originally intended frame. Question number 3. What are then the implications for civilians and others not fighting? And here, if you want, the Icrc brings in its extensive operational experience on the ground and at the intersection with the military thinking. This publication outlines the unfortunately usual humanitarian issues experienced by people in this context of armed conflict, and that the Icrc usually strives to respond to through its programs. It notably outlines both the risks and the opportunities that partners can seize, that allies, that supporting but also supported actors can seize to make a difference in the design and in the implementation of their partnerships. Very concretely, we're talking about the civilians at large, but also the persons deprived of their liberty, the dead, the internally displaced persons, missing persons and their families, everything that has to do with access to medical care, the protection of essential services, access to water, sanitation, electricity, but as well education very much, the protection of the natural environment, and the proliferation of and protection from landmines, explosive remnants of war, and so on and so forth. And maybe finally, question number 4, what steps can then decision makers, but anyone interested, anyone pondering over these matters, what concrete steps can they take together with their partners, prospective partners, to improve the level of protection and reduce harms to civilians and others not fighting? So we come up, you will be able to read it, with a breakdown of 10 areas in which practical measures can be taken to make a humanitarian difference along the life cycle of a support relationship, from the preparation stage to the implementation stage to finally finishing with transitioning out. And it offers decision makers an extensive set of guiding questions to help them factoring these humanitarian considerations. By extensive set, I mean around 500 questions, with multiple filters to apply depending on the type of conflict, on the type of actor, on the type of humanitarian issues, all these factors I have listed. To give you very concrete examples, whenever designing a support relationship, we do believe that questions related to monitoring and evaluation are key. So the questions that are put to decision makers are as follows. Do you have visibility on your partner's operations? If you're not too sure, or if the answer is no, maybe this is worth further investigating. How do you evaluate the humanitarian impact of your partner's operations? How do you determine whether the support you provide is used in compliance with IHM? What metrics do you use to review and modify the support relationship over time? What system do you use? What processes do you use to address potential misconduct by the partner, potential IHL violations that might have occurred? And how do you effectively investigate them? Voilà, this was just 3, 4, 5 questions out of a much wider set. And last, very last question, question number 5. If the gaps in intent, capacity, leadership remain significant, then do you ask yourself the questions of reconsidering entirely the support relationship? At times a bold, courageous, but a necessary questioning to make. So voilà, at this stage, you will have understood that we probably raise more questions than we bring answers. And even if many actors, many of weapon bearers that we interact with in the field have shared with us their own successes and shortcomings, the ICRC's aim here is to keep gathering more illustrations of the precautions taken and opportunities seized within such support relationships in order to widen the body of knowledge that is available on this, available to the ICRC, but available to all for the benefit of civilians and others not fighting, and make it available as widely as possible. As I said, and gave you the link, the publication is available on the ICRC's website. A dedicated website will be coming within a month or so. We very much look forward to engaging further on this at the ICRC. And maybe finishing with 2 questions. First, are you listening to us who might be involved actually in the design or implementation of such support relationships? Are you factoring in these questions? If not, well, hopefully a good bedside reading for the days to come. And if this is something that you are willing to discuss, the ICRC remains very happy to engage. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Van Hippen.
Great. Well, thank you, Thomas. That's really helpful. And I know it's often very difficult for some groups to even want to discuss any of this with you. And you always work very hard to try to talk to all parties in conflict. So we're really grateful for your expertise. Let's switch to the panel now. Let's welcome the panel. And let's start by talking about exactly what Thomas was referring to in the guide. What's at stake here? What are we talking about? And why do people even partner? I mean, it's an obvious question in some ways, but there are a lot of different answers. Let me start with Ottilia, because I know you know a lot about Libya. You know about what's happening more recently in Mozambique, which is a more complicated case because it's fairly new in the news, and we are still learning about what's happening. I think we're assuming that there are external partners involved, but some of us may not even know. So maybe let me turn to you for your reflections first.
Thank you very much, Karen, and a special thanks to Thomas, but also to the ICRC team for coming up with this initial report, which hopefully will help frame future conversations. Now, I'm going to start by restating the obvious. The obvious is that we see across a range of armed conflicts that it's not just a conflict between 2 parties often, and even where that is the case, that on both sides of the conflict, that there are various forms of support, partnership, technical and otherwise, that is offered by a range of actors. So it almost goes without saying that a conversation like this has to look at the issues from a holistic point of view. We're not simply speaking about boots on the ground, so to speak, but the range of other mechanisms and support that is offered. We're also speaking about whether or not these relationships are inherently positive. And if they're not, in which ways are they impacting the conflict itself, such as to prolong it, or the communities on the ground who themselves may not necessarily be even party to the conflict and may wish to be excluded. I'm going to focus now in my initial comment, but also when I respond to subsequent questions, Karen, on a range of contexts on the African continent where we see different forms of partnerships forming and where we see different kinds of support being offered. I will start geographically for those who are not familiar with the African continent. I assume everyone should be, from the furthest west, focusing on the range of partnerships that have been offered in support to countries like Nigeria in responding to the violent extremist threats posed by Boko Haram and Katiba Masina. I will then move to the Sahel in Mali, Niger, but also broader into Burkina Faso, looking at the support that is being given to the G5 Sahel. And then to the Lake Chad Basin more broadly, looking at the efforts at national and regional level to respond to crisis. North to Libya, where efforts have been put in place to help strengthen a failing state in many regards, but also trying to establish stability. And then to the Horn of Africa in Somalia, but also increasingly Ethiopia and Eritrea, where efforts to be able to mediate or respond to sometimes intractable conflicts as that with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and then southwards to the new case in Mozambique. I'm highlighting these now because all of these have various forms of support relationships. Whether it's the technical assistance that the Portuguese have offered to Mozambique in better understanding conflict, or whether it is the technical as well as military support that is being offered to the G5 countries in the Sahel by actors from Europe, the United States, further afield, but also locally, looking at ways in which regional groups like the Economic Community of West African States in West Africa has been able to offer. We're looking at, and I'm framing it in this way because we're looking at a complex web of different ways through which actors support. The question perhaps, and I'll stop here, is whether or not this is informed in a way to constructively engage in a conflict, or in some instances, unfortunately, in a way that actually makes things worse. I'll end on that note, Karen.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, you really captured the rich, complex picture of these conflicts. You know, I think you pointed out earlier, you can't separate the good guys from the bad guys anymore, because often good intentions can end up in a different place. Let me turn to James now. James, you've had decades working with local actors, with militias. You've done a lot of training. You've probably seen lots of stuff you can't talk about, but there probably are some things that you can talk about. What are your reflections? And I know you were also involved in preparing this guide too, so you really brought your own background there.
Karen, thank you, and thanks for your kind introduction. I think, referring to your opening comments around prevalence, I think it is fair to say we have seen a sharp uptick in the amount of support relationships that one is seeing. It's a product, I think, in part of the growing number of belligerents that one sees in conflict, and whether that's state or non-state armed groups. But it is leading to a overlapping web of alliances, if you like, often shifting allegiances, ephemeral, opportunistic, and often with questions around shared intentions, but which of course have impact both in the immediate term, but super importantly, I think in my experience, it's about the long-term impact, often after conflict has closed, but the impact on the humanitarian side endures. I suppose the quick point I would just make, though, in relation to these relationships, is that of course they can be discretionary. It is a an element of the power play that goes on in these conflict zones. But often, though, these are relationships of military necessity. So if you quote ISIL, to defeat ISIL, for those external elements, like those who are not present, for example, say in Syria, it required partnerships in order to be able to achieve that, and extremely important and globally net beneficial in terms of that ISIL's physical caliphate removed, its influence kind of greatly reduced. There will also be times, for example, where, of course, local problems are best addressed by local solutions. So there is a benefit in having a relationship, for example, with a local national security force. If you take, for example, what's happening in Afghanistan, the Afghan government needs to be able to deal internally with its own challenges, and therefore a support relationship which sees an external actor working with local forces is to net benefit. So I think there is an aspect in this whole discussion that these relationships may have positive, beneficial outcomes, but perhaps the underlying point, though, is that they carry risks, and perhaps we can come on to some of the risks as we go. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much for those opening comments. Peter, let's go to you now. You obviously have decades of experience in dealing with this. So some things you can talk about and some things you cannot talk about for obvious reasons. I know you were recently in Syria, and that one is just getting more and more complicated as time goes by. And often very hard to understand who's doing what externally, and you find probably many of these militias belong to several different groups. So it's just one of the most complex cauldrons we've seen in some years. Can you share some of your insights?
Thanks a lot, Karin, again, also from my side for a great introduction and for having me in this discussion. I think the Syrian case in many respects that you allude to is kind of an emblematic case of all the complications that both James and Attila have referred to, where they come together. Two things in particular strike me when I listen to James. He spoke about overlapping alliances, and I think this speaks also to the volatility of these partnerships and alliances that we are looking at the present moment. And definitely the Syrian case is one where I have always been surprised over the last couple of years visiting the country on how much the non-state armed groups in the field would partner and dissociate themselves on a daily basis and recompose alliances of another kind. So to the complexity that has been addressed on more actors, more internal armed conflicts, having alliances at all levels from global to regional to national to local. All these complexities are somehow compounded by the volatility of alliance situations as we see them in Syria, as an example. I think a second thing I wanted to highlight, just to give you also some figures from our side. I think we have two trends which, again, are emblematically represented in Syria. We have on the one side, over the last 20 years, a massive increase of non-international armed conflict, internal conflict compared to international conflict. But we also have a dramatic increase of conflicts with more than 10 key actors as parties to conflict. And I think that's a little bit the background which we are looking at today. Out of the 70, 80 conflicts in which Icrc is active on a day-to-day basis, maximum 1/3 is between two parties. More than 22% of these conflicts are between 10 and more parties. When I look, for instance, at a certain moment in Benghazi, Libya, we counted 135 armed groups, and we were not aware what exactly the structure, the chain of command, the relationship was. And I think that makes a little bit of the complexity and also the challenge. And maybe one word to what Thomas has introduced today as a report. Maybe also to the audience, look at the report as an initiative of ourselves to bring that to the forefront, but also as a template to understand what is happening. It's not the response yet, but it's a great analytical template. And the Syrian conflict, again, is a good one to see what actually happens. Every context, every alliance that we are looking at is very contextual, and it's time volatile. And I think the template that we are presenting helps to somehow have some common understanding of our reading of what is happening more globally, not only in a specific context. And that's the reason why those questions and the systematics of questions that we are presenting is so important. And finally, I think we see our role also in this new kind of conflict environment as an organization feedbacking what the impact on civilian populations is. And we strongly believe that there are responsible armed actors on the ground and which can inject into alliances and partnerships the concern that we are articulating about the impact of warfare on the civilian population. It's obvious that the last 20 years in the Syrian conflict, again, is an emblematic case in point. The civilians bear the brunt of a warfare which somehow has, in many respects, left its normative constraints, and alliances, partnerships, support relationships play a critical role, and at the same time are a complicating factor.
Great, Peter, thank you. Just one quick clarification. You said there are about 100 groups in Libya. How many external partners were you able to count that are supporting these various groups? How many of these groups have external partners, or do you not know?
Well, it is interesting now when you take the template that we present in our report today, you get somewhere between 10 and 20 who either in terms of troops, weapons delivery, financial support, logistical support are critically involved. And so, but I think it's an important question that you ask, Karin, because this is what I think is one of the specificity of what we are looking at. We see a fragmentation of the international environment in terms of support relationships, but we also see the proliferation of fragmentation on the ground in some of the contexts in which we operate. And it goes without saying that even mathematically, not to speak factually, this increases enormously the complexity to ensure respect, because ensuring respect in our traditional methodology is always going through direct dialogue with parties to the conflict. So when you get above the 10s and 20s, that's a big issue. But I think maybe one element I wanted to add, it also adds this complexity of working yourself through different layers from global to regional to national to local, which is so important and which you alluded to in your question.
Okay, great. We're probably confusing people more than anything, but it's a confusing subject area, but it's really important to be disentangling it like we are. Ottilia, let me go back to you on what are the risks inherent in partnered warfare? And given all those cases you mentioned, I'm sure you have a number of examples. So maybe talk a little bit about some of the risks that you've seen with partnered warfare, and then how you've seen them be mitigated in the best ways.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'll take an initial stab at the question, and then obviously it would be very interesting also to hear both from James as well as Peter on this as well. Now, in our initial responses to your question, all of us already spoke to some of the inherent risks when it comes to partnered warfare. Whether it is, as is the case with situations like Libya or Syria, which is a multiplicity of actors, sometimes almost making it very difficult to disentangle, to know exactly who now the primary actors are. That in itself makes it, unfortunately, very difficult then to work towards what I understand from Icrc, but also from a range of other actors, to make it better to actually respond effectively and to end the conflict. Now, when you look at the situation, for example, in Libya, you have a range of contributing issues and factors that are overlaid. A few years ago, as the ISS, we looked specifically at the co-option of the Coastal Guard in the anti-human smuggling business, so to speak, and how simply by virtue of receiving support from a number of European countries towards ending the smuggling business, we found certain groups that themselves had previously been regarded as parties to the ongoing conflict, using this as a tool to establish themselves as a legitimate entity. Now, when you're trying to mediate and negotiate peace between parties, and increasingly there are new actors, new people in the fold, some of whom see their position as being more legitimate as the others, you essentially, to put it simply, make the mess much messier. Now, if the intentions are good in terms of intervening in a particular context, how do you ensure that you mitigate such risk? It's a question of coordination and communication above anything else. It's not useful nor helpful to have a multiplicity of actors working towards the same thing, but simply not engaging with each other nor speaking and coordinating better. We have seen areas where coordination can help. Using the example now of the G5 Sahel, where we have seen countries that themselves on their own would not be able to respond effectively to the crisis that they're facing, both internally, but also in their border regions, that collaboration works best. But the G5 Sahel is not just a grouping of 5 Sahelian countries. They are supported and buttressed by external actors, financially, technically, and otherwise. Can they confront and face the same challenges that we have seen in Libya and be unable to respond? Yes, if they do not communicate and coordinate the way that they should, and if they aren't working from the same rule book, so to speak. And that is why I think this report, but hopefully also guidelines, clear and set guidelines to member states that speak to how best to engage is the right way to go. In the absence of that, we see partnerships that aren't necessarily being crafted towards responding to the threats themselves, nor towards mitigating the risks. And my final point, Karen, I think in all of this, there has to be an understanding of the importance of protection of civilians within these contexts. It almost goes without saying. In addition, and Thomas spoke about this, in all of these conflicts, we have seen mass displacements of people internally and out of those countries as well. There has to be efforts to address not only the conflict as it is raging in different contexts, but also its resultant impact and how it impacts neighboring countries that themselves may not be part of the conflict, but that now have to deal with the impact of said conflict.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a good point to end on. I'll turn to James with that about protection of civilians, because of course, as we know, sometimes civilians are purposely targeted and have been for many years. What are your thoughts on the risks that Ottilia was talking about, inherent risks and the mitigation issues and the protection of civilian piece that she brought up at the end?
Yeah, Karen, so plainly within a supported relationship lies a degree of influence that party that is providing the support has over those that they are supporting. And there's a choice as to how that influence is exercised. It can of course be exercised in a way that is seeks to be positive. And is leveraged as such in a deliberate fashion around that, seeking to instill a very clear moral humanitarian compass, I suppose, in terms of the nature of the combat that is exercised. Or of course, the influence can be negative, and that has a compounding effect, of course, in terms of how that negative aspect plays out. So I think these support relationships, the point is that they are amplifiers. They can either be an amplifier for good, or they can be an amplifier for worse. There's an element in all of this, I think, which is around the risk that responsibility, and particularly in terms of humanitarian responsibilities, becomes diffused within the relationship. Whether that is unintentional, it just gets diffused in the opaqueness of the arrangements, or whether it is intentionally diffused, and the ability to achieve ends hiding behind a proxy in a malign way. One of the bits, so that interesting, I think, in sort of in that last point, is an observation I suppose I would make, is that the increase of technical competence that sort of leading nations have, increased precision, increase destructive effect. One of the bits I've observed is that we're seeing often less casualties caused, but much greater destruction. I think that was a good example in, say, the efforts around Mosul, the efforts in Raqqa. Great efforts going into reducing the risk of causing civilian casualties. But the destruction such is that the long-term inheritance is extremely difficult, obviously, for these communities. And I come back to this point around diffusion of responsibilities. Whose responsibility is it over time? And I think kind of that often applies to all of the actors in the field, whether they're seeking to be positive or not. In terms of mitigations, it's been touched on, but there's a real importance, of course, around alignment of intentions. What is this support to be used to achieve what end? And alignment around the leadership that is applied, and the organizational structures that are applied in order to see that intent delivered. And it talks to me, I think, around sort of three, I suppose, core points. There's an aspect around selecting partners carefully. It is not always possible to have the partner that you will want, but one needs to analyze exactly what that arrangement represents. There's an element of course, around preparing oneself, that this is complex, bespoke activity. You need to organize for it. You can't just throw yourself at it. And indeed, it's good to see that many nations now are deliberately organizing their forces in order to optimize their ability to deliver these types of relationships in an effective and a positive way. And then that final one, which again has been mentioned, which is around engaging and monitoring one's partner throughout, and having the mechanisms to hold to account for when things, when there is a risk of this negative compounding impact. Thanks, Karen.
That last point is very important. I mean, I think in the past, governments have understood that occasionally they may, these groups you work with may have to partner or talk with people that may be on, some sort of bad list just for survival purposes. So, you have to be able to discern, as you say, in a bespoke way, is this a real partnership or is this just a survival issue for the moment? Are they talking to this group that may, work with ISIL because they don't, they will get killed, or are they actually trying to partner? And I think that's also very complicated, trying to untangle all of that. Peter, what about you? What are your thoughts on this whole question about risks with partnered warfare and mitigating these risks? I imagine you spent most of your career trying to mitigate these risks.
Well, I think I wanted to continue where James has also made a strong point. I think the diffusion of responsibility and its consequences are the major problem we are encountering in the areas of our operations. And when I look what the consequences of unclear responsibilities and also unclear chains of commands are, they are devastating for the civilian populations because they offer and open spaces for disrespect of the law, because there are basically ungoverned spaces in military operations, unclear accountabilities and chains of command. They represent security risk for our operations and therefore tend to close spaces for humanitarian operations because of the diffusion of responsibility and the unclear chains of commands. And where I would almost say that's the point where it flips, it's not only about civilians, it's also that diffusion of responsibilities over time does not need to, but can basically deprioritize parts of international humanitarian law, which would be in the interest of the belligerents themselves. And we have seen that many of the issues which are in the interest of belligerents themselves, recovering dead bodies on battlefields, exchanging detainees, that they are sort of slipping away in sort of diffuse responsibility structures of partnered operations. And at the same time, are anchor points for mitigating measures, for arguing the case of more collective responsibilities, for influencing those partnerships to take the normative framework of warfare more seriously, because there is something in for those who do war in alliances and partnerships also to improve. At the end of the day, in a medium and long term, it's also about the legitimacy of your military operation. If diffusion of responsibility leads to the risk I have mentioned, then it undercuts the legitimacy of military operations. At the end of the day, it makes reconciliation and finding together again minimal sort of consensus between the belligerents more difficult if you have a breakdown of responsibilities. And I think in terms of mitigating measures, I would make the point that the report that we are presenting here is a good template to look at mitigating measures, but I wanted to mention certainly training and engaging with all sides of a partnership, of an alliance is important. Looking at those behind the actors in the field is important, because sometimes you have partnerships, but you have also people farther away in the influencing zones of partnerships. So training is important. Operational dialogues are important. That's what our colleagues in the field try to do with all parts of alliances and partnerships in order to engage them in improving towards violations of international humanitarian law, conduct of hostility principles, detention principles, handing over of detainees. These are all procedures which can be brought in and leveraged in a positive way in terms of mitigating the negative impact of diffusion of responsibility. So it's part of our operational dialogue. And I think there are many other areas, but I wanted to highlight those two. At the end of the day, the question is whether we also manage to systematize some of the good practices, of the lessons learned, of the positive impacts that we can see, of the mitigating measures, of leveraging alliances and partnerships in order to have better respect, whether we can carve them into recommendations on ground rule, on operational delivery, on chains of command instruction. And this is, at the end of the day, what this whole project looks like to develop from today onwards. We are at the very beginning, and we hope that this conversation today is also a good start to then collect as much experience, as much good practice as we can over the next 12, 18 months.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I'm trying to incorporate some of the questions that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm really sorry about the sound quality today. It's not as good as it should be, so I apologize to everybody out there. The last round for me, but then I'm also trying to take in the questions as well, is about opportunities going forward and what successful partnerships look like. We are trying to answer some of the questions as they're coming in, and we're also trying to integrate some of your questions into these questions. So let me start with Ottilia again about opportunities and successful partnerships. You've given us some examples, but what do you think we should be doing given all the complexities that all three of you really have talked about and how complicated the situation is?
Thank you very much. One of the things, and this will be my sole point to highlight at this point, is often conversations like this are in response to situations on the ground, and very rarely is it, and this is a point that Thomas made earlier, which is around planning and preparation and almost foresight, if that's possible. And my point here is, as and when, and now, there's a lot of effort in terms of ensuring that there's some clear guidance and guidelines as well. And this is all happening in a context where one would assume that the rules of engagement, particularly in armed conflict situations, are well established. So it's not as if the efforts now that the ICRC is pushing is an effort towards reinventing the wheel. But perhaps the challenge that is faced, and this is now looking towards opportunities, is dealing with the situations that we currently have and not having the plans or strategies beforehand should a situation erupt or should a situation worsen. Now, this is where I will use perhaps the example of the context that we find in Mozambique at the moment. At the moment, regardless of who you speak with, there's no clarity as to who the actors are, even in respect of the ongoing conflict within the country. And then when you look at the potential partners and actors, it is very much still from a knee-jerk point of view. What is the opportunity there? The opportunity, and we've seen now with at least the Southern African Development Community coming together to look at ways through which they can be able to coordinate a response that is not singularly militaristic, but that is also informed by experiences elsewhere. And perhaps that is the way to go about it. But, and this is my caution and my last point, Karin, this cannot be in a short-sighted manner. We have seen what happens when knee-jerk type responses are the way forward, because quite frankly, we have a number of intractable conflicts, not only on the African continent, but elsewhere in the world. And part of it is about planning for the now, which needs to happen, but also taking time, let me put it that way, to prepare for if your immediate action does not succeed, what needs to happen and how do you go about it? So the partners need to be in the room, if I can use that phrasing, they need to be in the room and they need to be speaking with each other before we get to some of the points of crisis that we have across the globe at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Otilia. And also if I could add another one, which is those international partners that are supporting the governments or one of the partners, they need to also sustain it over time, right? We saw that in Iraq. We've seen that with the counter ISIL campaign. We've seen that in Somalia, right? They get very involved and then their attention drifts elsewhere. And then that's also when other actors are able to interfere more easily because they're distracted or not interested anymore. James, you have obviously a lot of experience in this. Tell us a bit about this. And a few of the questions that have been coming up in the Q&A are about, what do you do when you're working with someone and you see them breaking international law, but they're your partner? Or how do you avoid legitimizing, Alistair Burt and others asking, how do you avoid legitimizing partners if you're trying to work with them? They often sell the conversations with British forces, American forces, as a way to increase their authority. So tell us a bit about even more complicated challenges.
Yeah, Karen, I think as a general point, it's just really building on what Tilia said around seeing opportunity in the round. So, of course, the sort of combat element is only one part of a wider dynamic. It's multifaceted. It has a security component. Obviously, it's got social, it's got human values, it's got economic aspects. And one is seeking to bring net benefits in the round, in the near, and of course, in the long term, and framing one's engagement against that point. So there's elements there, for example, within the security realm of institutional development, their ability, a partner's ability to think through its problems structurally, to deal with them, having the right judicial processes, etc. And therefore approaching it on a broad front, within which, of course, humanitarian aspects in the near term have got to be presumably a fundamental aspect in relation to what human values looks like over time. I think there's a really interesting question, I think, about dealing with difficult partners. And I could quote examples of places where, for example, the cancer of ISIL was gathering momentum, unchecked, posed enormous dangers, both locally, regionally, and indeed for ourselves at home. How do you get that? How do you close that down? Potentially in an area where you can't physically deploy yourselves, where it's incoherent, it's a hodgepodge of militias, but potentially one of those militias is going to be a card that can be played that is going to close down the greater evil of what ISIL kind of represented. Very much that's the lane that I felt that I have been in, and in those circumstances, I think it is about framing very clear and narrow objectives. It's about giving sufficient tooling to allow that particular objective to be dealt with, and being mindful at all times that the support that one is giving isn't being deflected to deal with some other tangential thing, as your partner might view it, and that there is this conditional aspect around it, that this support is conditional on certain behaviors, and then being very deliberate in the way that one builds a picture as to how they are operating. So it can be, for example, we have plenty of ISR. A line of ISR is placed deliberately over your partner to ensure that you can operate in support, in good conscience, that what you are doing is right. There is also, and often this would be a sort of question, I suppose, highly, an important political question for ministers, as to what is the net right political thing to do. Should you be associated with something, with an organization which can only be described ultimately as a sort of malign actor when set out in sort of black and white, but which is necessary to deal with a greater evil? And there's an element here around, is there net benefit to be drawn from having a relationship that one is able, in having that relationship, one is able to impart some values than not going there at all? It's a really difficult judgment, and it's one which I think people, are often having to face. Thanks.
Yeah, well, great. That's a very good point. Peter, over to you a bit. I mean, I think you obviously speak to all parties when possible. I'm not sure what kind of relationship you've had with some of the ISIL or the other jihadist groups, for example, in Syria, but have you been able to, because of your behind the scenes quiet work, have you been able to persuade some actors to change your behavior, or are there some that are just beyond the fold and you're not able to really reach?
Well, we think we do have stories which speak to the point of being able to influence partners, and that it is worthwhile looking at patterns of influence within partnerships and alliances, but also to look at influences outside these alliances. And in particular, when you look at some of the groups that you were just alluding to, influencers in the context in which these groups are operating are important. Again, I come back to influences of local communities, to influences of religious leaders as opinion makers in the way war is waged. I just remind you, we have worked, for instance, with the Ayatollah al-Sistani in Iraq to have him issue a fatwa for the protection of detainees, for the respect of women and children. So there is influence possibilities within an alliance and support structures, which we have discussed and which offers risks and opportunities and dilemmas, as James has mentioned them just beforehand. But from a humanitarian point of view and how we are deployed, we also try to look at influences outside. So there are positive stories, obviously, where we can point to better behavior. If I look at 20 years of engagement with the Taliban in Afghanistan, I would recognize that if nothing is perfect in the world, but we see a pattern of improved targeting of military objectives against civilian objectives, not always, not everywhere, but we see some positive results. I think we have worked hard over the last couple of years also to recognize that structured armed forces and non-state armed groups have different buttons to push and different patterns of influencing their behavior. Group behavior and norms within groups are much more important in non-state armed groups than they are in hierarchically structured armed forces. So there is something to look at, and also experiences to share and to bring within, again, the pattern of influence within an alliance. Maybe one thing I wanted to highlight as well is, James spoke before at the very beginning of discretionary parts and military necessity part, which come into play when we look at alliances and partnerships. I think one of the concerning elements we are dealing with is the competitive part. Very often groups can choose between supporters on the one side or the other side of global or regional power competition. And I think that's an element which today makes influencing within and outside of alliances particularly difficult, because it's not that there is only one girl in town here. In the perspective of a non-state armed group, there is a broad panoply of states who, for competitive reason, offer their support. And that makes the importance also of thinking more systematically, in a more preventive way, in a more preparatory way to those relationships, and also highlighting some of the risk of not thinking about the long-term and medium and long-term consequences for military operations. So these are just a couple of elements I need to add.
No, it's certainly getting more complicated for those reasons, and some countries just want to interfere to, put their fingers in the eye of, let's just say, the U.S., for example, and they don't necessarily, and so they can make the conflict worse. A question for all of you. I'm going to combine two questions, but one of them is from Alistair Burt, which goes on from a point I made earlier about often Western governments need some sort of support if they're going to partner with some groups that that may be unauthorized or may later get into trouble. Then they have their own parliaments, their own, you often get slammed, but in the US it's Congress saying, why are you working with these actors? And maybe these are the best actors on the ground. They need some sort of support so that they don't get into trouble. And so often they're afraid to take the risks to support certain groups in the field. I know that's the same in the US. I certainly went through that when I worked on Syria in the State Department. And I'm sure it's the same here in the UK. Are you hoping that your publication can make these realities more obvious, I think, to help decision makers understand that, or is it more about this, policymakers having to do a lot of outreach and explain exactly why they're doing it to their own public? And Peter, let me start with you on that, and then I'll go the other direction.
Well, I do believe that the Allied Partner Proxy template, as we put it forward, makes things more transparent, and inevitably in more transparent systems will also surface to the political arena. It's inevitable, and it is very frankly at the same time a dilemma for an organization like the Icrc, because this template that we are presenting is also, on the one side, an agenda for engagement, for engaging confidentially and trying to influence partnerships. And at the same time, we can't just exclude that some of these discussions then come into the political arena, become political debates within governance structures of allies and partners. And I think in that sense, we will have to carefully manage and also to have probably from our side a clearer idea on what is a decontextualized conversation with military practitioners in order to improve and to build spaces for improvement into a partnered relationship, and what is part of a more concrete, specific issue that we will continue to prefer to have as a part of Icrc's confidential dialogue. Because the last thing we want to do with this publication and in using this template is certainly to politicize partnered relationship, and therefore then to make it as about a controversy, a partisan controversy. I think it is thought and should be a guide for professional engagement and not a guide to politicize. We can't sort of completely exclude that these things are happening, but they will happen anyway. And therefore, I think our commitment is to use diligently such a template and see how we can bring decontextualized lessons learned and best practices into professional military conversations, into alliances conversations, into peacekeeping operations, into a space which normally is debated at least at levels of Chatham House, and very specific issues which we will continue to insist to treat in the realm of confidential dialogue with parties.
Okay, thank you, Peter. James, let me go to you now, and then I'll go to Attilio for the last word about Afghanistan. If the U.S. is pulling out troops, although I understand they may leave a couple thousand for some sort of training element. Peter had mentioned earlier that they have made progress in Afghanistan. Will the absence of troops, in other words, the Brits will probably remove their troops and other Westerners will as well if the U.S. does. Will the absence of troops give breathing space? This is a question from one of the participants to the government and the Taliban to negotiate, or will it enable the Taliban to take over the country, given how much control they already have over the country right now? So here we have, foreign partners withdrawing, choosing to withdraw. It's a live case. Well,
Karen, and these, of course, can only be my kind of personal views, obviously. And I'm afraid my answer is a bit obvious, that it is extremely difficult to tell. If it was clear, then judgments around this would have happened earlier than in the last 20 years. And that the critical point, it seems to me, is that whether troops are there or not, sorry, I lost you, Karen. Whether troops are there or not, that the international community's attention on Afghanistan remains as full energized as it has been thus far, and whether that's in terms of economic support or holding to account or whatever it must be. A lot of people, including myself, spent quite a lot of time there, and it would be the most awful tragedy, of course, if Afghanistan sunk back into civil war, not least and perhaps most importantly from a humanitarian point of view.
Okay, thank you for that. I realize it wasn't an easy question to answer. Ottilia, you mentioned earlier on Mozambique that it's so complicated we don't fully understand. On the other hand, early on in a conflict, it may be the best time to try to disentangle this so that more and more actors don't come in and make it even more complex later on. It's a bit of a conundrum, but have you thought about that in your research, or do you want to comment on anything else?
Thanks for that. I think with, I use the example of Mozambique now, but even Mozambique is a bit late on the part of the international community. And mind you, when I frame the international community, I include Mozambique's neighbors as well within the sub-region, within Southern Africa and the continent, and then also external actors as well. Things that are not in question are the existing other interests within, whether it's Mozambique or any of the other countries in conflict. From a private sector point of view, and this is a point in the discussion that we've had today, we haven't touched on this, and perhaps this is to Icrc and RUSI for an event at a later stage, that explores the range and complexity of the different actors involved. Who needs to be in a room when you're discussing an ongoing conflict and how to address it? And it's perhaps because we have always had a very state-centric approach to engagement that we miss, if I can use this metaphor, but we miss the forest for the trees. We miss the issues that are being dealt with at a local level at the moment. What engagement has there been in Mozambique with Total as a private entity with the largest gas exploration interests in the region, And then the country it's from, France. What engagement has been there with the various gemstone companies in the north of Mozambique and the main entity or country-wise involved from a business point of view, Australia? What engagement has there been with the neighboring countries who are directly impacted by the situation in northern Mozambique, for example? These are questions that can be asked specific to Mozambique that I feel, in addition to the 5, Thomas, that you've highlighted as broad questions to be posed, that can be asked in any context. I think at least for the 5 of us on this panel this afternoon, there's one thing that we do agree on, which is that ideally conflict should be resolved, and ideally that this should be done as quickly as possible. However, ideals are not what is running conflicts across the continent or the globe. And then we need to be looking at which actors, some of whom we may not necessarily like, but which actors need to be in the room and what conversations need to be had with them. My final point, Karen, I know that the event is pretty much done for today. But my final point, and it's to re-stress something that we've all said, but we've said it in different ways. You simply cannot have mechanisms of accountability if we don't even know who's responsible. And so it's important in framing these partnerships that there be clarity internally, but also in external communication as to who the parties are and how they're engaging. Because without that, we are not able to then hold anyone accountable, because then everyone is accountable.
Okay, fabulous. You really helped us prepare for the next panel that we're all going to have where we can talk about these other issues, Ottilia. I mean, especially you're right about the private sector. I don't think we manage that in the way that we should. We don't bring them in as significant factors. That was a really excellent way to end this. I wanted to mention, I apologize to everybody for not getting to all the questions, but Tomas has promised to get back to everybody directly. I tried to blend some of your questions in because there were so many very good questions, but I really apologize. This is such a rich, complicated subject area that I'm not sure we did it justice today. So we may have to invite you all back, if you don't mind, to do it again with us, where we can talk about maybe we can delve deeper into these issues. But in the interim, the ICRC's guide is available for download. Certainly take a look at it, and I'm sure they're happy to answer any questions and help promote improved interaction in these areas. So let me just say now we've gone over a few minutes, and I apologize for that. We have another event today at 4. If you can join us with Sir Peter Westmacott, who's talking about his new book. And then at 5, we have an event on gender and conflict and security on CVE and the impact of gender there at 5 p.m. If you want to register, go to the website. But for now, can I ask you to virtually join me in clapping for our fantastic panel of experts who really helped make this subject even more complicated than it is, which means it was a success. So thank you very much to all of our speakers and to ICRC partnering with RUSI on this. And apologies again for the sound quality on my end. Thank you.